PIES, PISAS and the PIE Abacus Intermediate Level Training, Section 5F, Extending the PIE Abacus via Sharing Assessments for Research. Those who are working their way methodically and in sequence through this training will recall that from the beginning one of the drivers for the development of an assessment approach and for the revised PIE framework was the concern to develop an evidence base for the effectiveness of PIEs. With that came the need for an account that was more objective, at least in the sense of using observable features, and at the same time more detailed to take into account such a wide range of manifestations of the underlying approach, though these might be customized in particular specific services. As the Research and Evidence Conference that sparked off what was to become the PIES 2 Working Party and its later discussions, as the conference was asked, how do we research something which is evolving, innovating, fluid and responsive to particular needs and circumstances, multifaceted with those 5 elements or constituent parts, and all about complex needs which will require complex, possibly very personalised responses. So in this, the concluding section on the features of the PIE Abacus, we'll look at the way that the PIE Abacus may be able to help develop an evidence base for the effectiveness of services practice developments and more overall systemic interventions. There are many kinds of methodologies for research, and the research community, and for that matter many governments, are still overly impressed with medical and laboratory research, which sees meta-analysis of statistical research on single-issue interventions as the gold standard in research. Meanwhile, at the other end of this scale, we also see a tradition of in-depth micro-studies, exploring the lived experience of usually a relatively small number of individuals and in a particular real-world context. Such studies, especially within psychology, will often use an interpretative phenomenological methodology, although ethnographic research also fits in the same picture. And these can bring a scrupulousness in methods which at least raises such studies above the level of mere anecdote. So this is one approach that can shed real light on what matters in human terms, in a way that larger scale and more statistically minded approaches simply cannot do. They may fall short of that supposed gold standard of large scale and replicable findings, and the broader picture is open to interpretation. That is, they add depth, but for understanding of the context in particular, they must, to a greater or lesser extent, rely on what we all just already know. So for our purposes, that is to study the value of complex interventions, contexts and environments, there's a severe limit to how far this is actually a productive alternative. Nevertheless, in between these two opposite poles of broad quantitative and local phenomenological research, we also do have research which attempts to explore the effectiveness of interventions, but by spanning a number of examples of such more complex changes. These must cover a number of different settings where face-to-face and deeply personal interviewing by the researchers themselves is either not suitable or not available. So for this kind of research, gathering together a reasonably wide range of participating services is helpful, provided that, firstly, the participating services themselves can work in some personalised depth with the individuals they work with. Secondly, provided they can work with a single framework for a relatively coherent and consistent overview. And thirdly, that the research and the researchers can be informed on other factors in each setting that may influence the course and the success of any particular intervention. Well, the PISAS assessment framework here provides a reasonably consistent overview and a single coherent but multifaceted systemic account of the work of any participating services, with the scope for those variations that might affect the findings fairly clearly identified. Researchers wanting to liaise with a range of services will value being granted online access directly to the views of frontline staff, managers, users, and other stakeholders. Bearing in mind here that the proxy input function means that your service users can also give their own views on the intervention or on any aspect of the research that concerns them. And that's an essential point of view for any research. For the purposes of research, we can readily create a bespoke field to be added to and used by any of the participating services. And in this way, the research question and its potential findings can be located in the much richer description, which may well be useful in identifying the context of improvements around any one intervention, the wider context of local systems in which they take place. It's also likely to produce better quality data if it's based in self-assessment material where it's actually useful to the agency in the interests of the staff to get that input data right. We observed earlier that there is no long tradition of evidence generating in the homelessness sector, though in initiatives such as the UK's Centre for Homelessness Impact, we are seeing the beginnings of attempts to gather together research on effectiveness. And organisations like FIANSA at European level are keen to develop research and to promulgate findings. We would certainly encourage all of those with relevant research to submit their papers, and we hope to be able to continue to feature any papers specifically on PIEs on the PIE link. One last comment overall on research on complexity per se. The PISAS is a process evaluation measure, not an outcomes evaluation measure. That is, it asks to what extent your service works as a PIE, but not what the measurable benefit for service users of doing so may be in enhancing the experience they get. They can give their own views, but that's not quite so measurable. And in the meantime, the outcomes a service is supposed to achieve are usually set by the funders and the funding that they've already attracted. Rather than suggesting that services simply evaluate outcomes in the sense of measuring them, what we can suggest is that services think more carefully about what suitable outcomes to sign up to are when attempting quite complex interventions with people with complex needs and often quite long-term histories. Research must help to illuminate these complexities from both angles, the complexities of the needs and of people's responses and the complexity of these services. Researching the effectiveness of PIEs as an essentially holistic model nevertheless creates challenges for the research community, which is generally more comfortable with gathering evidence for single interventions in carefully controlled circumstances. But this is a challenge that we share with many multifaceted or systemic interventions. Recent research on mindfulness, granted that the PIE approach could be described as essentially a form of mindfulness for services, mindfulness at service level. So let's close with the words of Professor Rebecca Crane of Bangor University, one of the leading centres on mindfulness research. And she says, there are tensions inherent in the process of applying a paradigm that emphasises measurement and outcome to a paradigm that has many dimensions that appear inherently unquantifiable. We cannot wish away those tensions, nor resolve them at a stroke, but we can aim to inform the research for evidence with better focused specification of the key practice elements, and by bringing all the key elements of the context into the systemic analysis of particular interventions with greater clarity and greater coherence. And at this point, we more or less conclude our run through the essential features of PIE's pizzazz, the PIE Abacus. So let's come on finally to sum it all up.